This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Auric Erin, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas of St. Paul is writer and narrator.
It may seem strange that these mushrooms which you see before them should be called the fruit of the tree of liberty, but that's what they are. These mushrooms are the fruit of the tree of liberty. You have probably read this poem before by William Butler Yeats, but I should like to remind you of it for this number of our series in the Irish Diary. This is called The Rose Tree, and it is one of Yeats's political poems based upon the revolution of 1916, which, as you know, initiated the present Irish state. The Rose Tree. "Oh, words are lightly spoken," said Pierce to Connolly. "Maybe a breath of politic words has withered our rose tree, or maybe but a wind that blows across the bitter sea." "It needs to be but watered," James Connolly replied, "to make the green come out again and spread on every side, and shake the blossom from the bud to be the garden's pride." "But where can we draw water," said Pierce to Connolly, "when all the wells are parched away? Oh, plain as plain can be, there's nothing but our own red blood can make a right rose tree." Now, this particular poem suggests really the emphasis of this particular number of the Irish Diary. I must preface it with the brief comment that no country in modern times has had the tragic experience of Ireland. Perhaps I needn't remind you of that, but you have all heard, particularly in view of the new book on the subject, you have all heard of the great famine that came after 1845 in Ireland. I should like to remind you, for the purposes of this program, that at the time of that famine, much, much more food was removed from the country than would have fed it over and over again. So that the famine actually was not all that it seems in popular parlance. Nonetheless, it was one of the great tragedies that has ever struck any nation, because it started the depopulation of Ireland. At that time, Ireland had a population of over 8 million. In fact, it's not certain just how great the population was, but we know it to have been in excess of 8 million. And at that particular time, Great Britain had 19 million people, slightly over twice, or we should say perhaps twice and a half, the population of Ireland. Now, what is the situation? Ireland now has half the population she had over 100 years ago. Ireland now has a bare 4 million people, and England has over, when I say England, I mean Great Britain, has over twice the population she had then. In other words, had Ireland followed the normal experience of most European nations, she would now be feeding well over twice her present population. But because of the great tragedy that surrounded the famine, not the tragedy of the famine, that was the failure of one crop, but remember that other foods were forcibly removed from the country, grain and meat, so that Ireland had sufficient food in the country to feed that population, but that food having been taken away, the people died by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands, and, this is even more important, they fled. So that Ireland became indeed the weeping Niobe of modern times, her children fleeing from her, and our American authors of the time, Melville and Whitman and others, commented upon this quite freely. So you see, this tremendously tragic experience had this profound consequence, that ever since people have been leaving Ireland, so that perhaps the worst problem to confront Ireland in the past 100 years has been this constant draining away of her manpower, her children leaving her and draining away the opportunity of the future. There then was the problem of liberty. Because Ireland was not free, she could not raise her own right rose tree, to use William Butler Yeats's words. Now, Holland, for instance, is a country that's quite a bit smaller than Ireland, and yet Holland manages to feed 8 times the per square mile population that we find in Ireland. Holland, half the size of Ireland, manages on each square mile to feed 8 people to the 1 person on Irish soil. Ireland, in other words, for the purposes of her governor or her conqueror, if whatever term you'd like, Ireland, for the purposes of her governor, was being exploited and turned into a great ranch. Now, what happened then with the freedom that Ireland gained in 1922? What were the practical results of that? The practical results of that were that Ireland was able to raise a tree of liberty on which we begin to get a new growth. Now, you'll forgive my artwork, it isn't the best, but I want to suggest to you what happens with that tree. So shall we say then that the roots of the tree are watered with the blood of Pierce and Connolly. This then is the tree of liberty. And shortly after the birth of the new Irish nation, a tree begins to grow which we might call the beet sugar tree. So this is the beet sugar tree, watered, nourished by the blood of Pierce and Connolly, the martyrs who gave us really the liberty of the present state. Now, sugar, we know, is one of the great modern luxuries. Now, we call it today a necessity. But we want to remember, of course, that sugar was not always the necessity that we think it is. It was a relatively scarce commodity in the Middle Ages. The Arabs probably introduced it early in the 7th century to Mediterranean Europe. And we know, too, that sugar comes from many different kinds of plants, from maple, sorghum, aloe, cocoa palm, and the beet. Now, 18th century scientists discovered that beet juice has essentially the same sugar constitution as cane juice. And then in the 18th century, you know, we had some of these extensive wars, and we had a conqueror by the name of Napoleon. And we know wars speed up social changes, economic changes, and so on. So when Napoleon discovered that the scientists had found out that beet sugar was essentially the same as cane sugar, he ordered 70,000 acres immediately sown to beets, so that, you see, he would not be dependent upon sources, foreign sources, for his sugar. This is common in wars. We manage to speed up changes that would inevitably come anyway. So that by World War I, beet sugar was the leading source or the leading type of sugar in all of Western Europe. In fact, it was the chief source of the world supply, even for Asia, but not for Ireland. Why? Well, because Ireland was not free. It was not free to manage its own affairs. But by the end of World War I, Ireland itself was in flames, shall we say, the flames of open rebellion. And shortly after the foundation of the Irish Free State, which, remember, was 1922, shortly after that, in 1924, we have the beginnings of an Irish sugar industry. Now, why is that so important, and how is that connected with the Tree of Liberty? Well, this is what I hope to be able to point out to you. It's a fascinating, extraordinary story of what happens when a man is free to manage his own affairs. Because we found now that growing out of this tree came a great fertilizer industry. So here was one big branch. Since the beets now, the beet industry, founded in 1924, just drifted along for about 10 years. And then suddenly in 1933 and 1934, took a great spurt, and several factories were immediately founded. But then we discovered, as World War II came along, that fertilizers were hard to get, so a fertilizer industry grew on the tree. Then it was discovered that we needed machinery, so another branch grows on the tree. And we discover that Ireland is all of a sudden a machine-making country for the first time in its history. This is extraordinary. It's almost unbelievable. But the Irish developed a type of machine for harvesting beets which was suitable for local conditions, so that now 90% of all the mechanically harvested sugar beets in Ireland, 90% of all of those have been harvested by this one machine. This machine, it's interesting to note, was developed with some American assistance. The designer was an American, but he was invited over to Ireland. His name was Armour, if you should be interested, A-R-M-E-R. He was invited over to Ireland specifically to test out the Irish theories of what their machines ought to be. And these machines are now being exported. Well, then we have another branch. Now we decide or discover that potatoes can be processed in a modern manner, reducing them to flakes, so that in another part of the country, in Western Ireland, a new potato industry develops. Then we discover there's need for a research laboratory, and we have this developing. And then we discover that land reclamation, useless bog area, offers opportunities in the west of Ireland. And then we come to the one that I want to spend most of my time on this program talking about, this remarkable development that we call AFD. Well, now then, here is our Tree of Liberty, the beet sugar industry, which would never have come into being had not the tree of liberty been watered with the blood of the Irish revolutionaries. But now we find that we have fertilizers, food laboratories, potato industries, land reclamation, all these kinds of things, and all of them testimony to the fact that when people have charge of their own affairs, then they can begin to do something about it. Now, the original acreage that was sown to beets was 44,000 acres, and in the short space of time from 1924 to 1964, 40 years, this has doubled, so that Ireland is supplying itself with sugar. Last year exported some sugar to England, but has signed a contract with England now agreeing not to export more sugar to England, but instead of that to export it to the 6 counties in the northern part of the country which are still under English control. So this is an extraordinary history growing out of this little humble vegetable that's had this long history through Napoleon and right into our little country of Ireland, giving rise to a number of industries, but in particular now to the one which we call AFD. Let me show you some illustrations of AFD foods, because this is a modern miracle. Believe me, it's extraordinarily exciting and something you can hardly believe until you have heard and seen some more of it. Now these illustrations, for instance, and this was the illustration which we used on the beginning of the program, these mushrooms growing on the tree of liberty. Mushroom soup, Erin Foods. Now these are more, however, than just soups and other kinds of foods. Vegetables of one description or another, instant potato flakes. We have potato flakes on the American market, but there is something different about these in the sense that the cell structure has not been broken down and their taste is entirely different from anything in the way of other potato flakes. And this, of course, abroad, you know, you've heard fish and chips. We are more likely to talk of French fries, but chip potatoes, carrots. There's a limit. I don't want to continue showing things of this sort to you, but there are, for instance, steaks that can be had like this. It's extraordinary, of course. You see, these things are quite light, very light, and a pound steak is hardly heavier than a little rolled up newspaper. And I don't mean one of the big dailies, but perhaps should we say one of the small town weeklies. You can get fish, you can get prawns, shrimp, things of that sort. Now let me tell you then what this food is and how significant it is to Ireland. I mentioned the word AFD. What is AFD? What's so strange about those letters? AFD means accelerated freeze drying. Combination of freeze and drying is rather unusual, isn't it? We know that foods have been processed in many, many different ways since man has come upon this earth. Foods have been dried, they've been canned, they've been preserved in salt, they've been preserved in sugar. And in our time, we think the latest word is that they have been frozen. But actually, this is out of date. This is so cumbersome. Frozen foods, ridiculous. Why? Well, in the first place, you have to be so careful of them, don't you? When you get them in the supermarket, sometimes, if they're delicate enough foods, well, they're put in a special wrapper so that they won't thaw by the time you get home. And of course, if you have an electric power failure, what happens? You have to worry about your freezer. So you see, it's really medieval frozen foods. That is, compared to the new AFD process. Because in the AFD process, the moisture is all withdrawn from the food while it is still in a frozen state. And the food after that can be stored in your cabinet, just where you now put your cornflakes. And it can be kept there for a couple of years. When astronaut Cooper went for his little spin around the world, what did he take with him? Accelerated freeze-dry foods. First of all, they're light, and secondly, you don't need a freezer to tote around with you. But they're not just something, you know, for camping trips or for astronauts. These accelerated freeze-dry foods are now being shipped to hot countries like Africa, places in Asia. They're being shipped to the continent, and they're beginning to trickle into the American market. And the extraordinary thing is that the Irish were the first ones there. The Irish brought this process into commercial use, and there it is on the Tree of Liberty. But for that, you see, but for having their freedom, there wouldn't be any such thing. Well, then just let me tell you a little bit about them. No matter what you do to food, you interfere somewhat with the texture and the flavor and sometimes the color. We know this. If you dry it, it wrinkles and twists. We know that if you can them, the flavor isn't quite the same. And we know we have problems with frozen foods too. The flavor is remarkably good, but sometimes they can toughen up, or sometimes the flavor does alter slightly. The least change is introduced into foods in this new process of accelerated freeze drying, which the Irish Sugar Company, or the Cólacht Siúcra Éireann, the Irish beet sugar manufacturer, has brought into being, and which they now market under the title which you saw a moment ago, Erin Foods. Erin, you know what Erin means, surely. It's a word that has been used in English for a long time, even though it's the genitive case or the dative case of the noun éire, which is the word in Irish for Ireland. So Erin Foods, then, are these accelerated freeze-dry foods. What is the process? Well, now, you may have seen your wife hang clothes out. I don't know, maybe the women don't hang clothes out any longer, but when I was a boy, they did. They hung the clothes out on the line, and even in the winter, clothes were put out, because it was remarkable, even though the clothes froze stiff and solid, they seemed to dry. Now, how do you explain this? Except that the moisture was evaporated as gas, as vapor, without going through the intermediary stage of returning to liquid. In other words, it is possible, while something is frozen, to remove the moisture from it under certain controlled conditions. Remove it from it as a gas, as a water vapor. And if this is done, then the resultant food is, the resultant product is a dried food. But dried now, not by heating, but by freezing. So, since most foods are 70 to 90% water, actually a given volume of, let us say, cabbage will have more water in it than the same volume of milk. It's remarkable, but think of a tomato. It's nothing but water. But even a pound of steak has so much water in it. So that if in freezing this, we can remove the water, we have something left now, which is essentially the same proteins, the same salts, the same nutriments, the same cellular structure, nothing twisted or distorted. But it's like a sponge. It's hollow because the water has been removed. And all you have to do to reconstitute one of these foods Just pour a little water on it and the thing grows before your eyes. The thing grows before your eyes. Or to take, as I did, take one of the prawns, which is something like a shrimp, take one of these prawns and put it in your mouth, put it on your tongue, and inside a moment or two, you have a almost live prawn on your tongue. It's phenomenal. Now, the process has been known for a long time, that is, since the 20s. It's been used chiefly in medicine, for blood plasma, for instance, and certain other biologicals. But the difficulty was that it was terribly expensive, and therefore you just couldn't expect to get your steak done this way. And secondly, it was slow, very, very slow. Well, now, in the 1950s, again because of war pressures, you see, the British began experimenting in a station in Scotland, in Aberdeen. And they found that they could produce these things quite reasonably, at least compared to the previous prices. And then this process was more or less shelved for the time being. It was thought it might have some military significance. But the Irish scientists of the Irish sugar industry, keeping track of world events, thought to themselves, well, now, here is one way in which we can repopulate our country, because we can build up a new thriving export industry. We can grow food intensively and have no longer a ranch here, but intensive farming. And we can manufacture, and we can ship this to the world. And this is precisely what they did. Now, why didn't other companies and other countries do it? Well, it's the old story. If you spend a lot of money investing in a new design for your automobile production, you're stuck. You can't retool because you have to recover the investment there. So here was an example, you see, of the fact that the Irish, coming late on the scene, were able to capitalize upon a new idea. And because the tree of liberty had been well watered and was flourishing beautifully, they were able to sprout branches all over. One of them, an entirely new food process, which is now sweeping the world. And you may soon find on the shelves of your supermarket, not in the deep freeze container, but on the shelves, an accelerated freeze-dry product, the Erin Foods. And take your steak home in your back pocket. Add a few drops of water, warm it if you wish, or eat it cold. It's already cooked. A remarkable development, isn't it? But again, we're not interested in the fact that the Irish were the first there. Maybe we'll soon find out it was really a Russian Irishman. We're not interested in the fact they were the first there, but in what this means for Ireland, the rebirth of a new country.
If you would like a list of suggested readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA-TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.